Welcome back to your new favorite obsession, the NeuroSpicy MomPod. As always, I'm your host, Austin Marie, and I am so glad you're here. If you are new around here, this is the little corner of the internet where we explore neuroscience, psychology, neurodivergence, parenting, healing, and all of the messy, complicated ways those things show up in real life. My goal is not just to help you understand how your brain works, but to help you understand yourself with a little more compassion. Because when we understand our nervous systems, our stories, and the systems we've been shaped by, we can start making choices from a place of awareness instead of survival. So grab your favorite fidget, something cozy to relax with, and maybe even a fun beverage, and let's get into today's topic. In American culture, we are immersed in an individualistic, pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality. So much so that most people don't realize that the phrase, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, was originally a sarcastic metaphor used to describe an impossible, absurd task. So it makes sense that so many people in our society suffer in silence when the advice they're given is often just as impossible and absurd. This culture sells us the idea that we can achieve any dream as long as we hustle hard enough and put in the work without acknowledging the systemic barriers that most people face. In the same way, we praise billionaires as self-made while ignoring the enormous financial advantages many were born into, as well as the unpaid workers whose labor helped generate and concentrate that wealth in the first place. We live in a society that celebrates individualism and pushes us away from community, interdependence, and support, while simultaneously denying the reality that we are not all born into an even playing field. People are often expected to think their way out of mental health struggles that are, at least in part, created by the very systems they live within and cannot easily escape or change on their own. Your geographic luck, where you happen to be born, and whether or not you were born into generational wealth certainly influence your mental health outcomes. But something even more fundamental plays a role: the kind of brain you were born with. Neurodivergent individuals, including many people identified as gifted, have brains that function differently from their neurotypical peers. As a result, they often experience and interpret the world in ways that differ from the cultural norm. Research suggests that this difference can contribute to a unique form of depression known as existential depression. If you grew up as an undiagnosed neurodivergent person, there's a good chance that before anyone considered your neurotype, your struggles were labeled as depression, anxiety, a mood disorder, or even a personality disorder. This places the responsibility for fixing the problem squarely on your shoulders. And when we're only looking at the surface, we're missing everything underneath. We're focusing on the symptoms while overlooking the context that created them. Because beneath the anxiety, beneath the depression and burnout and self-doubt is often an entirely different story. And that's where the real story begins. Unfortunately, this is a very common scene in my therapist's office. Me sitting there in tears, questioning out loud whether my depressed state is actually something I can heal from when the circumstances creating so much of my stress remain unchanged. Wondering whether my ongoing financial instability is the real problem or whether my inability to feel hopeful is evidence that my brain is somehow broken. Wondering if maybe this is just what life is going to feel like forever. A series of heartbreaks, traumas, losses, and financial struggles that I never quite recover from. And then almost immediately, the guilt kicks in. I think about my dear friend Samar in Gaza, who is living through circumstances that most of us can barely comprehend. I think about the reality that even living below the poverty line in America, I still have privileges that billions of people around the world do not. Logically, I know that. So then I find myself trapped in a second layer of suffering, stressed about meeting my family's needs while simultaneously feeling guilty for being stressed in the first place. I started wondering whether I'm somehow approaching all of this wrong. Maybe if I were journaling more consistently, practicing more gratitude, paying closer attention to my thought patterns, or doing a better job managing my mindset, maybe I wouldn't feel so overwhelmed. It's easy to internalize the message that if we're struggling, there must be some personal habit, perspective, or self improvement practice we're failing to master. But the reality is that stress is stress to the body. Now, before anybody comes for me in the comments, obviously not all stressors are equal. Losing your home is not the same thing as being frustrated while planning a family vacation. Living through war is not the same as getting stuck in traffic. But our nervous systems are not particularly interested in ranking human suffering on a moral scale. The brain is remarkably sophisticated in many ways, but one thing it is not especially good at is determining whether a stressor is logically justified. It simply detects threat, uncertainty, overwhelm, loss of control, social rejection, financial insecurity, or unmet needs, and then responds accordingly, which means that even people who appear to have everything they could possibly need may still be living with chronic stress that leaves them anxious, dysregulated, exhausted, and deeply unhappy. The brain is not in the business of determining whether every thought is true. It is in the business of conserving energy. It builds shortcuts, creates patterns, categorizes information, and makes predictions about what comes next. For many neurodivergent individuals, however, those pattern detection systems operate a little differently. This is where the existential depression enters the conversation. Researchers have long observed that certain populations appear more vulnerable to existential concerns, particularly individuals identified as gifted or highly intelligent. In fact, psychologist James Webb, writing for the Davidson Institute, argues that existential depression occurs disproportionately among gifted individuals because they possess both the cognitive ability to contemplate life's biggest questions and the emotional sensitivity to feel the weight of those questions deeply. Many researchers have also argued that giftedness belongs within the broader neurodiversity framework because gifted brains appear to differ neurologically from the statistical norm. Studies have identified differences in gray matter volume, white matter connectivity, and communication between brain regions. Some research suggests that highly intelligent individuals may integrate information across multiple neural networks more efficiently, allowing them to see patterns, relationships, and contradictions that others may overlook. In other words, these brains are not simply processing more information, they are often processing information differently. And that difference matters because existential depression is not simply about feeling sad or hopeless for no apparent reason. While biological factors can absolutely contribute to depression, existential depression often develops when a person begins grappling with some of the biggest and most difficult questions human beings have ever asked. Questions about death, freedom, isolation, purpose, suffering, and meaning. Questions like, why do people suffer? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why are some children born into safety while others are born into war? Why does injustice exist? And why do people claim to value kindness while rewarding cruelty? Why do systems continue operating in ways that harm people when we know better? Most people encounter these questions at some point in their lives. However, many neurodivergent individuals seem to encounter them earlier, more intensely, and with greater frequency. Part of the reason may be that neurodivergent brains are often highly attuned to patterns, inconsistencies, and contradictions. Many neurodivergent people also experience heightened emotional sensitivity, a strong sense of justice, and a tendency toward deep reflection, all of which can make it difficult to ignore suffering or accept simplistic explanations for complex problems. As a result, many neurodivergent individuals find themselves constantly aware of the gap between how the world is and how it could be. They can often envision more equitable, compassionate, and logical ways for society to function while simultaneously recognizing how far current reality falls short of those possibilities. That awareness can be both a gift and a burden. This experience shares some similarities with what psychologist Kazimierz Dabrowski described in his theory of positive disintegration. Dabrowski proposed that individuals with heightened intellectual, emotional, sensory, and imaginational sensitivities what he referred to as overexcitabilities, often experience profound internal conflict as they wrestle with moral, philosophical, and existential questions. According to Dabrowski, the same traits that contribute to creativity, empathy, insight, and personal growth can also increase vulnerability to distress when a person becomes deeply aware of human suffering and the imperfections of the world around them. When the heightened awareness is combined with a chronic stress that many neurodivergent people already experience from masking or navigating inaccessible systems, feeling misunderstood, or constantly adapting to environments that were not designed with their needs in mind, existential depression can become even more intense. In other words, sometimes the issue is not that a person is irrational, broken, or incapable of coping. Sometimes the issue is that they are paying close attention to the realities that many other people are able to ignore. And while awareness can be valuable, it can also be painful when it exposes us to problems that feel overwhelming, unsolvable, or deeply unjust. Before we go any further, I think it's important to make a distinction between clinical depression and existential depression because although they can overlap, they are not necessarily the same thing. Clinical depression is often characterized by persistent low mood, loss of interest or pleasure, changes in sleep and appetite, difficulty concentrating, feelings of worthlessness, and in some cases, thoughts of death or suicide. It is associated with a complex combination of genetic, biological, psychological, and environmental factors. Sometimes there is a clear reason someone becomes depressed, sometimes there isn't. Existential depression, on the other hand, is not necessarily rooted in a loss of meaning. Ironically, many people experiencing existential depression care deeply about meaning. They care deeply about people, they care deeply about justice, suffering, purpose, morality, and the future. The problem is not an absence of caring. The problem is that they care so much that it becomes difficult to carry. A person experiencing existential depression may find themselves constantly asking questions that do not have simple answers. These questions are not symptoms of pathology. They are questions that emerge naturally when a highly reflective mind begins grappling with the realities of existence. So, why do some people seem particularly vulnerable to this kind of thinking? Part of the answer appears to lie in how neurodivergent and highly intelligent brains process information. Modern neuroscience increasingly views the brain as a prediction machine. Every second of every day, your brain is collecting information, identifying patterns, making predictions about what will happen next, and comparing those predictions against reality. This process allows us to navigate the world efficiently without having to consciously analyze every piece of information we encounter. For many neurodivergent individuals, however, that predictive processing system appears to function somewhat differently. Research has found differences in both gray matter and white matter among highly intelligent individuals. Gray matter is involved in processing information, while white matter functions like the communication network connecting different regions of the brain. While studies have found greater connectivity between brain regions in highly intelligent individuals, suggesting that information may be integrated across multiple networks more rapidly and efficiently. In simple terms, these brains may be more likely to notice relationships between seemingly unrelated pieces of information. They connect the dots constantly. And while that ability can fuel creativity, innovation, problem solving, and insight, it can also create a unique burden because when your brain is constantly identifying patterns, it becomes difficult not to notice contradictions. You notice the gap between what people say and what they do, and the gaps between societal values and societal behavior. You notice the gap between the world we have and the world we could create. And once you see those gaps, it can be very difficult to unsee them. This may be one reason that researchers have found strong associations between giftedness, heightened emotional intensity, and existential concerns. Many neurodivergent individuals also experience something we've talked about on this podcast and what researchers call justice sensitivity. Justice sensitivity refers to an increased awareness of unfairness, inequality, hypocrisy, and harm. Studies have found elevated levels of justice sensitivity in both autistic and ADHD populations, which may help explain why many neurodivergent individuals experience such intense emotional responses to social issues, discrimination, environmental destruction, poverty, violence, and other forms of suffering. In other words, many neurodivergent people are not only noticing more patterns, they are noticing patterns that carry emotional weight. Their brains are continuously processing information while their nervous systems are simultaneously feeling the impact of that information. And that combination can be exhausting, especially in a world where we now have access to more information about human suffering than any generation in history. At any given moment, we can learn about wars, humanitarian crisis, political corruption, environmental collapse, economic inequality, and human rights violations occurring anywhere on the planet. For a brain that is wired towards deep analysis, strong empathy, and relentless pattern recognition, that information doesn't simply disappear after scrolling past it. Instead, it becomes part of a much larger mental framework that is constantly being updated and reevaluated as new information comes in. Many people can compartmentalize what they see and move on with their day, but for individuals who naturally process things more deeply, those images, those stories, and patterns often linger long after they close the app or turned off the screen. Over time, the brain begins connecting those experiences into broader understanding of how the world works, and that understanding can become increasingly difficult to carry. As that awareness grows, so does the emotional weight that comes with it. This is not because we are weak, overly sensitive, or incapable of coping with reality. In many cases, it is the opposite. We are paying attention to realities that many people either do not notice or are able to set aside more easily. The challenge is that human beings evolved to navigate the problems of small communities and immediate environments, not to absorb a constant stream of information about suffering, injustice, conflict, and a crisis occurring across the entire planet. When a person is continually taking in that level of information while also feeling a strong emotional connection to it, it is understandable that the weight of that awareness can eventually become overwhelming. Okay, so if you're listening to this and thinking, okay, Austin, great, my brain notices everything. Now what? You're asking a fair question. One of the things I've noticed in my work is that many of us have spent years assuming the problem is our awareness. We notice things other people seem to be able to ignore. We notice contradictions, suffering, the injustice of it all, and when something doesn't make sense. After a while, especially if we've been told we're too sensitive or too intense, it's easy to conclude that life would be easier if we could just stop paying attention. But I don't think that's actually the answer. The traits that make someone vulnerable to existential depression are often the same traits that make them thoughtful and compassionate, creative, and deeply engaged with the world around them. The goal is not to become less aware. The goal is to develop the capacity to hold that awareness without being overwhelmed by it. One idea that has been particularly helpful for me is learning the difference between concern and responsibility. There are many things I care about deeply. I care about children who are being harmed. I care about poverty and violence, climate change, and systemic injustice. I care about the future my children will inherit. Caring about those things is part of being human. The problem begins when concern quietly turns into a sense of personal responsibility for problems that no single person could possibly solve. This is something I see frequently within myself and other neurodivergent individuals. When we see a problem, we want to fix it. When we see suffering, we want to alleviate it. When we see something that is unfair, we want to challenge it. Those impulses come from a good place. However, no human is equipped to carry responsibility for every painful thing they become aware of. A question I often have to come back to is, what is mine to carry today? Just what is mine to carry today? That question helps create a boundary between witnessing suffering and absorbing it. We can care deeply without taking ownership of burdens that were never ours to hold alone. Another thing that can help is being intentional about how much distressing information we consume. To be clear, I am not suggesting that people become uninformed or disengaged. Gross. Staying informed matters. At the same time, there is a difference between being informed and exposing yourself to a constant stream of alarming information that your nervous system has no opportunity to process. Human beings were not designed to absorb every tragedy occurring across the globe in real time, and our brains and bodies need periods of recovery. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is to step away from the news, put down your phone, and reconnect with the reality immediately around you. This might mean noticing the tree outside your window, listening to your kids' laughter, taking your dog or cat for a walk. For me, it's taking my morning coffee to my favorite spot by the river. Those moments are not acts of avoidance. They are acts of regulation. The nervous system recovers through connection with the present moment. Finally, awareness needs somewhere to go. One of the reasons existential depression can feel so heavy is that people become aware of enormous problems while feeling powerless to influence them. Over time, that combination of awareness and helplessness can be overwhelming. Meaningful action helps interrupt that cycle. I am not talking about saving the world. I am talking about doing something concrete, having one important conversation, volunteering for a cause you care about, donating to an organization doing good work, setting a boundary, helping one person, taking one step that aligns with your values, or consuming ethically and consciously. Those actions may seem small compared to the scale of the problems we face, but they matter. Action reminds us that while we cannot do everything, we are not powerless. In my experience, meaning is rarely found in having all the answers. More often, meaning emerges when we decide how we want to respond to the reality we see. Awareness by itself can become despair. Awareness paired with purpose becomes something else entirely. It becomes a way of participating in the world without being consumed by it. As we wrap up today's episode, I want to return to something we talked about earlier, Dabrowski's theory of positive disintegration. Now, I realize that positive disintegration sounds like the world's least reassuring self-help concept, but the heart of Dabrowski's work is actually quite hopeful. He believed that periods of internal conflict are not always signs that something has gone wrong. Sometimes they are signs that an old way of understanding ourselves and the world is no longer sufficient. Sometimes the discomfort we experience is the growing pain that comes from developing a deeper understanding of who we are, what we value, and how we want to live. That doesn't make the experience easy, and it doesn't make the grief, the overwhelm, the anger, or the sadness disappear. But it does offer an alternative possibility. What if your awareness is not evidence that you are broken? What if your sensitivity is not evidence that you are weak? What if the part of you that cannot look away from suffering, injustice, or human complexity is not a flaw that needs to be fixed, but a deeply human quality that needs support, boundaries, and care? The world will continue to be imperfect. There will always be problems we cannot solve, losses we cannot prevent, and questions we cannot fully answer. But meaning was never found in controlling all of those things. Meaning is often found in how we choose to show up despite them, in how we love people and in how we contribute to our communities, in how we care for ourselves, and in how we continue creating beauty, connection, and kindness in a world that desperately needs all three. And perhaps most importantly, meaning is found in remembering that you were never meant to carry all of this alone. If today's episode resonated with you, know that there are so many of us asking these same questions. You are not the only person who feels overwhelmed by the state of the world. You are not the only person who feels the weight of things deeply. And you are certainly not the only neurodivergent person who has wondered whether awareness itself is the problem. It isn't. And remember, the goal is not to become less aware. The goal is to become more supported while carrying that awareness. And that, my friends, is a very different thing. Now, before you go, I'd love for you to spend some time with this week's journal prompt. But if this is where my time with you ends, again, thank you so much for being here. Please consider sending this podcast some love. Every like, share, and comment really helps this grassroots podcast gain ground. If you want to join us on our message boards, then head over to the Patreon and subscribe to the NeuroSpicy MomPod, preferably on a desktop because Apple will charge you a little fee if you do it on your phone, and we don't want that. Thank you for spending your time with me this week, and don't forget how loved you are. Now, let's get into the journal prompt. What is one burden I have been carrying that was never mine to hold alone? As you reflect, consider the difference between concern and responsibility. What problems, worries, or injustices do you care about deeply? Which of those are genuinely yours to act on, and which have you been carrying as though their outcome rests entirely on your shoulders? Then ask yourself, if I redirected some of that energy toward one meaningful action that aligns with my values, what would that action be? Remember, you do not have to solve everything. You only have to decide how you want to participate in the world today. Take your time with these reflections, and if you feel called to share them, head over to our message board. And again, thank you for being here with me today. Take care of yourself and take care of your nervous system. Ta-ta.